So now here's the question all the Twitter people are gonna love. You yourself, how do you feel in your riding? Like, what percentage would you give yourself of being an MLA come fall?
Yeah, and that's the answer. That's the question my wife wants to know as well, right? Splitting the vote and they don't have enough candidates to win or something like this, which was just straight up fake news.
Welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is Dylan EDU, and welcome back to my third DYLANCAST. And today I'm joined by Bryan Breguet. Bryan Breguet is the owner of the website Too Close to Call, which is a polling aggregate and modeling website. I think I'm saying that correctly. And he is also the Conservative Party of BC candidate in Vancouver Langara. So, would you like to introduce yourself further than that, Bryan?
Sure. Hi, Dylan. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast or video. I mean, so you describe it pretty well. I've done political analysis and projections for since 2011, really on my website, Too Close to Call. I covered multiple elections, got some successes, some failures like 2015, 2019. Pretty good track record over the last few years. And then last year, I finally decided to make the jump to realpolitik and to join the Conservative Party of BC. And I'm running in the Vancouver riding of Vancouver Langara, which is where I work because I teach economics at Langara College, which is a community college. I think it's one of the biggest one in BC. It's one of the biggest public ones uh, in the province, and I've been there since 2012.
Okay, well, let's just jump right into questions. My first question is, how did you become a candidate for the Conservative Party of BC? Like, what was the process? Like, granted, you guys are in the growing phase, I guess, regrowing phase right now, but how did you actually get to become a candidate? Like, what was the process?
Yeah. So, and I was discovering it myself for last year. So, if people have followed me online on Twitter, on my website, I became more partisan after 2019. I was kind of done just being a, projection maker and being objective or neutral all the time. And I was like, I'm not having fun. So I became more partisan. And so by doing so, I became friends and closer to more partisan people on the right, like a Conservative Party of Canada or in BC, like the BC Liberals or other right wing people. And last year at some point, I knew Angelo, who's the executive director of the party, and we were discussing that it would be a good idea for me if I ran. And so that's really the early phase of the party, right? A year ago, people maybe don't remember, but we were uh, we were polling at 15, 16, 17%. But even there, a lot of this was it was difficult to believe it was real because the BC Conservatives didn't exist for real until like really a year or 18 months ago. And but in the polls, they've always gone up between elections because sometimes people get confused with the federal conservative. So a year ago, it didn't look that real, but we were, they were worried about not being able to find candidates everywhere. And so I volunteered my name to run either in my riding or in the one where I work at Vancouver Langara. And so after this, you go through a pretty lengthy process. Like there is an application. I think I still have it somewhere in my on my desk over there. It's it's at least 30 or 40 pages of pretty intense questions. Like you have to give them access to all your social media. And for instance, you have to go on Twitter and there is an option to export all your tweets in like a zip file. And so you need to give them this. You need to give them access to your, well, Facebook profile. If you have Instagram and whatnot, you also give them access to this so that they can vet you. Many questions as to how you stand on some issues, why you want to run. You need to have some references. You need to do a criminal background check, like you need to pay for this and to actually have that you don't have a criminal record. And you send this to the party along with like some small application fees, and then they review it. And uh, from there, it depends where you are. In my riding at that time, I was the only candidate, so I got acclaimed. Nowadays, given how well we're doing in the polls and depending on which riding you want, you're gonna be facing competition, and there would be a nomination race and vote. But I was lucky enough that I got in early enough that I didn't have to do this.
So what are the main core policies and like principles of the BC Conservatives that caused you to want to run and join that party?
Yeah, so obviously we don't have a full platform out there, right? We're waiting for the election, but we already had like a program like on the website, right? I mean, general ideas and some specifics, but some more general. You know, I'm a center right guy, right? I've always have been uh, a center right guy. I'm conservative fiscally. Mm, I would say I used to say I was socially liberal. I think I'm socially moderate now by modern standards, given what the social debates are about. And I just went on the website a little bit over a year ago when the party had a short leadership race and when John Rostad won. And I looked and I was like, well, I agree with pretty much all your solutions, right? I mean, on healthcare, they were the only party who were like, well, we need to do real reforms. We don't want to just give more money to the same system that has been falling or failing for decades. Um, Axe the tax, I mean, the carbon tax has it's just taxing people into poverty and punishing them for living where it's cold. And it's completely distracting to me for the real issue on climate change and what we should actually be doing. There was a lot, we don't talk that much about this, but for me, and if you go on the website, I believe it's still there were mentions of how we need to probably have better democracy and, for instance, more direct democracy, like more referendums out there. And I quite like this. Because, well, I'm originally from Switzerland, so I come from a country where we have referendums every other week, which is too much, I realize, but I would like to see my province have, or Canada in general, if we could have referendums once in a while. I think those are great. Not on every issue, and sometimes you cannot have them, but I would like to to have more direct democracy. I think they're a great way uh, to allow people to express themselves outside of an election period. So yeah, I mean,
Didn't
I
they
just
also
remember.
propose like more stuff regarding recalls and that kind of stuff? Or
Sorry
doesn't
for what?
BC already have recall elections?
We we do. So on paper, BC is a pretty good province on this, where we can have recalls. We can ask for a referendum if you collect enough signatures. The problem is the way it was written is completely phony. It was written by people who didn't want referendums, who didn't want recalls, but wanted to pretend that they had those. And so if you look at the details, it's absolutely insane. To require one referendum, you need so many signatures. The only time it has been successful was against the HST, and it only happened because, well, essentially a party, the NDP, and many groups organized themselves and managed to force the vote. So it's not impossible, but it's not really a good populist version of what I'm looking at. So if we could lower this requirement not to a crazy low number, right? Again, I don't want referendum on everything every other week, but there should be a middle ground to me as to when people can ask to say what you have to say.
So for viewers at home that don't know, the BC political system is kind of stuck in a situation where they have the BC NDP on the left, then they have the BC Greens like somewhere in the middle there-ish. I don't know really how to describe them. Then they have two parties that both claim to be center right, which is the BC United Party and the BC Conservatives. Now the BC United Party actually used to be called the BC Liberal Party, but they were always more of a center right-ish party, and they were like fairly successful electorally under Gordon Campbell and Christy Clark. However, now the BC United Party is seemingly headed for lack of a better term, destruction. Like there's many models that say they could end up with literally 0 seats. So my question is, how is, apart from electoral prospects, how is the BC Conservative Party different from the BC United Party?
So I think, and we need to go back a little bit in time, like a year ago, where, you're correct, right? The BC Liberals, before they renamed themselves, for decades, they were the Black Party that would cover everything from the right to the center right to the center. And so they were very successful. We call it in BC the Free Enterprise Coalition. So mostly socially progressive people of voters, but who care about having smaller government, lower taxes, this type of thing. So that was pretty successful. Um, but what happened over time is there has been this realignment, right? I mean, and if you follow politics in the last 10, 15 years, you know that the same line of what used to be left and right isn't really the same. You have these people who, for instance, used to be urban, socially progressive, high income people who used to vote right wing because they wanted to go to have lower taxes. But over time, they have shifted to, for instance, the federal liberals, and they're perfectly fine with having large deficits and higher taxes. So I think BC, the way the BC conservatives really have changed the map is the BC liberals used to just take actual conservative voters, or people who would vote conservative at the federal level, they would take them for granted. And like, well, you guys have no options. You're gonna be with us, but we're gonna completely ignore you. And so if you look at when Kevin Falcon became leader of the BC Liberals in 2021, 2022, he became like this incredibly centrist guy. And being centrist on its own, it's not a bad thing. You know, I'm myself centrist on many issues, but there is his version of centrism was we don't stand for anything. We never have position or anything. We don't want to upset, you know, the left or the right. And I think what happened is, especially when inflation started to rise and housing became really a crisis, he read the room really wrong. And there was this opening for an actual conservative party that was, you know, more, again, not extreme, not radicals, but openly conservative, actually offering something different from the NDP and not being ashamed of saying you're conservative. Uh, I feel Kevin Falcon for about his first year, didn't even want to be seen with Pierre, for instance. You know, he was almost afraid of the federal conservative and to look too extreme. Obviously, that has changed a little bit over the last 6 months, where now that they renamed themselves, but now that they're mostly polling at like, what, literally 9% in the last poll, well, they realized that their strategy wasn't working and they're trying to be this common sense uh, conservative party. So they're trying to copy us. I mean, on many issues, on the visual, on the rhetoric they're using. But you know, people are not stupid. They're not buying what the BC United are selling. And we live in an era where, again, if we go more political sciencey, uh, the center is not doing very well, right? I mean, we have an increased polarization, and we people like to have clear choices. The same, and we see it everywhere, right? The federal liberals who used to be centrist, while they're now polling, you know, they could finish third or fourth in seats. In Alberta, the Alberta Party, that was the centrist party, is all but dead. They just don't exist. So their voters just split between NDP and the UCP. So I think we're seeing the same in BC. We're seeing a new map with two parties that are one very clearly NDP center left, BC conservative center right, and I don't see a space for BC United anymore.
So BC, obviously, like the rest of Canada, has a first past the post voting system. Is there any, I'm sure you've been asked this a million times, but is there any risk of vote splitting between the two parties? Like, are you at all worried that that could result in an NDP majority, just given two center-right parties?
Yeah, so I mean, I was very, very worried about this like just 6 months ago, right? When I think it was January, February, polls were starting to be NDP at like 40, 45%, which is usually where they are over the last 20 years. Like 39 is like their floor. But we were at 25 and BC United was at 23. So this was like a nightmare scenario, right? Where if you made projections out of those, you would get the NDP winning like 80 seats out of 93. Like that was a bloodbath. They would even win most of the interior with like 35% of the vote, just thanks to vote splitting. So there was a very real concern. And you know, polls were clearly showing that uh, the second choices of, for instance, BC United were mostly BC conservatives and vice versa. So we were showing some of the same voters. But it's not the case anymore, right? I mean, polls over the last 3, 4 months have clearly put us well ahead. We vary between what 33 and 38%, and BC United is now between 9 and 14. So there is, you know, the vote splitting is a lot less problematic than it used to be. I think, for instance, it's almost non-existent in the interior of the province. It just doesn't matter. We're gonna win these seats without even if BC United remains and have a candidate. Um, in
One of the
other
only
places,
seats I can think of that vote splitting might be an issue is actually your seat, just because, well, your BCU incumbent, Michael Lee, isn't running again. He just announced, like, I think we're at
yeah,
half of BCU. MLA is not running again.
yeah.
So that says a lot. But like the NDP probably won't get above 50% regardless. But is that part of your strategy? Is to like convince BCU voters, of which there might not be many, to still support, like to support you as a method of overcoming the NDP?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I meet people every week who are worried about this. And we need to remember that the average person out there isn't as terminally online as as I am or as maybe you are. So we follow polls, we follow politics, we know where we stand. The average person out there doesn't, right? They think about politics 10 minutes a year, so they don't know sometimes. So when I go door knocking, sometimes I remember it wasn't in my riding, but I was helping another candidate in riding the suburb. And this guy was really, really into the conservative. It's like, yeah, yeah, I like you. Give me a flag, give me a sign on my lawn. And then he realized that we were the provincial conservatives, not the federal ones. And he completely changed. He was like, "Oh yeah, no, but you guys are splitting the vote. I don't know. I like BC United." And that was a crazy conversation to me because back then we were already polling way higher. In this riding where he was living, literally there's still no BC United candidate. So, it wasn't nobody's splitting us right now. And we're like, well, we're here, we organize. And but he had heard on TV. He had heard on TV one journalist say, oh yeah, they're splitting the vote and they don't have enough candidates to win or something like this, which was just straight up fake news. So you need to fight this. And but it's not that difficult, I think, because again, the data now is really on our side. Uh, and the trend is really good, right? I mean, I'm almost certain that BC United, by the time the election is over, they're gonna be in single digit 5-6%. They really have almost no constituency left. And at this point, actually, I think, but this is where we get almost too technical. Uh, I actually don't know if we would be better off with BC United being at 0%. I think at some point we need to realize, and I think Abacus research showed this in a poll, that right now their voters are almost 50-50 between federal conservative and federal liberals of BC United. So if they were to disappear, I think it helps us, but it will also help the BCNDP mostly in the same way. So instead of being 38-38, it would be 42-42 or something like this. So I think we're at the point where we got most of their right-wing voters who would be with us. The game now is to try to get a little bit more out of them.
So talking about the BCNDP, why should voters support the BCNDP as opposed to the BC Conservatives? And what is your pitch to BC NDP voters who might be considering making the switch to a center-right party?
So wait, just to be clear, you're asking me to convince NDP voters to come to us?
Yeah,
Yeah.
basically. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think and that's what I say every time I meet people. I think it's beyond specific issues, right? I will gladly discuss healthcare, or taxes and whatnot, if that's what you care about. But I think we really live in a situation where everything is broken, right? Really. And I know, I don't want to sound like just copying Pierre federally, but we are really in a situation where if you ask people, are you better off today than 4 or 5 years ago? Most people will tell you not. I mean, they pay more for their house, they pay more in mortgage rates, they pay more taxes, they have worse healthcare, their kids get worse education. So really, there is almost nothing that is better now than 5-6 years ago. So if that's the case, why would you be voting for this party that has been in power since 2017, right? I mean, they have been in power for a long time now, the BCNDP. So they cannot blame the previous government for their problems, right? So really, I think to me, it's a question of like general vibes. for lack of a better word, where things are not working and you're not happy in your life. You know things. You wish things could get better. So at this point, you now have an alternative, a serious one with a good team, good candidates, good policies. Give us a chance, really. I mean, you've given it a chance to the NDP, and that's what you got.
So, what is, like, again, you mentioned Pierre Polyev a little bit. What is the relationship like between the BC conservatives and the federal conservatives? Like, that's the thing that a lot of my American viewers in specific don't fully understand, is the divide between the federal parties and the provincial parties. But like, basically, they're not the same thing. And has Pierre said anything to suggest who he would support over the BC? Has Pierre said anything to suggest who he would support in the BCU versus BC conservative feud or whatever?
No, I believe that the few times where Pierre Poilievre has been asked, he has been very clear that he's not getting involved, right? I mean, he's obviously doesn't like the BCNDP, but he's not running, and that's not his job to just endorse political parties. So my guess is gonna remain neutral the entire time. So, and that's fair, I mean, I don't like when politicians, you start having somebody from Quebec endorses somebody from British Columbia, stay in your lane, right? I mean, do what you're supposed to do and focus on your job. Uh, so the short answer is, there is no official connections, right? We're two different parties. It's not like the NDP where if you're BC NDP, you automatically become a member of the federal NDP, and so you have this with the Liberals, or at least you used to have this in a few provinces as well. So for us, we're two different parties. You can be a member of one and not of the others. Um, we have candidates who federally have been, you know, BC United loves to attack us about this, right? Some of our candidates used to be federal NDP, I believe, and they're like, oh, see, they're not actually true conservative, but that's not how it works. Different elections, different levels, different times, and so you you're free. We welcome everybody in our, we're a big tent party, right? And that's what we need to do when we have a first past the post electoral system. So with that being said, just because there is no official connections doesn't mean that, when I go to political events, we obviously see each other, right? I see people, I have friends who are members or volunteers of the federal conservative, and we obviously get along pretty well because, well, we're conservative. So we agree on most issues out there. So I think that would be really where we stand. So that would be amazing if you could get endorsed officially. But as I said, I don't think it's going to happen. And objectively, that's most likely for the best. I mean, I think we really want to avoid this type of the fact that it's the same at every level.
Okay, my next question for you, Bryan, is what are like just vibes? How are you guys feeling going into the upcoming election? How are you feeling in your constituency? Do you guys think you can beat David Eby this fall?
Yeah, we feel very good, right? And it's not political spin. I mean, well, we can read the polls, right? But we can also see the reactions at the door, the reactions when we organize events. Even in Vancouver, we've hosted events about education or short-term rentals, for instance, in the west side, maybe like 5 minutes from David Eby's office, and we were getting hundreds of people to come. So reactions have been very good. Polls have been very good. Fundraising has finally, become really good as well, right? I mean, we used to lag there. So no, I always joke that 6 months ago, I remember somebody high in the party. I had a meeting with him, and he would be like, "Oh, we're at 25%, but I'm pretty sure, my objective is to be at 40% by September." And honestly, back then when he said this, I didn't fully, I was like, I don't know if it's gonna happen. I feel it's already pretty amazing to be at 25% as a new party. But then, yeah, sure enough, we started being at 30, 35, 38, 40. And so no, for sure, we're going for the win. I mean, we're not going for, and when you look at the recent candidates we've added to in your writings, we're not going to just be spoiler or to be even official opposition. We believe we can win this election, and I think numbers, everything show that we can. It's not going to be easy. The BCNDP is a very well organized party. Uh, the electoral system and the electoral map uh, make it such that Metro Vancouver looks like a orange fortress, really, and it's really a source of many seats. that's how they won, right? I mean, let's forget 2020, right? Because it's a weird election with COVID, but 2017, the NDP won because they kind of swept most of Metro Vancouver, right? So
They
it's
didn't
all of
even
Vancouver except
technically
two
win. They
ridings.
just made the alliance with the Greens.
Yeah, yeah, and after this, but after the election, right? They did manage to win most of the suburb, all of Surrey, all of the Tri-Cities, Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam. So those seats are they're pretty solid orange. So they're not gonna be easy to flip. Uh, I think we will be able to flip a few of those, but ultimately this is where the election will be decided, right? I mean, interior we know mostly what's gonna happen. Fraser Valley, it's relatively predictable. And then you get Burnaby, Vancouver, where we know the NDP will win like most of those seats. It's not being, let's be realistic there. We're not winning Vancouver Strathcona or Vancouver East. But after this is really on the edge, right? Richmond, my riding, the Tri-Cities. And so those battles, 6 months ago, we had no chance. Like really, we couldn't win those seats. That there was no possibility. Now we're at the point where it kind of depends on the poll, it depends on your model, right? I have my own model with my own assumptions, and I get different reactions or different projections than 338 Canada or other people who do it on Twitter because it's such a difficult election to predict. We essentially have to add a new party that didn't exist, and so you have to make assumptions. But now, when you talk to people, they're incredibly optimistic. Sometimes, again, 6 months ago, I would say they were too optimistic, but I've been proven wrong, so they were right.
So now here's the question all the Twitter people are gonna love. You yourself, how do you feel in your riding? Like, what percentage would you give yourself of being an MLA come fall?
Yeah, and that's the answer. That's the question my wife wants to know as well, right? I mean, I will be honest, right? I mean, I like being honest with people. I think if the election was tomorrow, I wouldn't be favorite in my riding, and I think all projections, including mine, I'm probably behind by between 2 and 8 points. It depends. I think in my model, I'm down 5, 6 points. So I would give myself a like 35% chance. It would take either a better campaign or a polling error or something like this here for me to win. Macaulay, which was a strong incumbent, leaving is a pretty good news for me. I mean, because obviously he was the number 2 of BC United. I actually think at some point he might have had better chances to keep his seats than Kevin Falcon, the leader. So yeah, we're what? We're July, end of July, 35% chances. So not favorite, but real chances of actually being elected to the and winning my seats this October. So what we're gonna do from now, right? I need two things. I need myself to go work even harder, more door knocking, IDing voters, and whatnot, and and then I need the party to also slightly improve. I would say if we could start getting polls with us at 40% and winning the popular vote, even by 2 or 3 points over the NDP, then I think this is becoming really real, like really where you're like, okay, I can win this thing, which again, a year ago, chances were 0%.
Well, you went into this as basically a paper candidate, and now
Yeah,
you're legitimately looking at an office in Victoria, which
yeah.
is and
It's pretty crazy. And at some point I had to make the choice, right? I mean, because exactly between the time I decided to run and the time we announced, there were a few months, and it went from you cannot win to oh, actually you could win. And so I had to decide, almost to confirm again, but like, okay, do I actually want to run? Because it's a different commitment level, right? I mean, so now that you need to be more serious, you're gonna have to work harder than maybe what I had anticipated a year ago. And that's why I decided, yeah, no, I'm gonna do it. I mean, let's take it seriously. It's even better, right? I mean, I was willing to run and with no chance of winning just to, practice and get my voice out there and argue on some issues. But if I can do all of this and win, this is even better. So I'm taking it, very seriously now.
now here's one thing I'm very curious about just looking at 338. Who do you guys have a candidate in Vancouver Point Grey? Like that's David EB's riding, right?
Yeah.
Do you guys have a candidate there yet?
We do. Well, we actually, the candidate Paul Rashford has been there since even before me. He was announced last fall. So that was one of the first candidates we announced.
I
He's a
think
great guy.
338 has him at like 40-36 though. Like David Eby's at risk in his own riding.
So, so
It's insane.
I don't want to start like a projection war, but I believe that as it stands, the model of 338 for BC is not the best model out there. And I genuinely believe that you have Twitter people with like 1,000 followers who have a better model than him. And I think the reason is he hasn't spent enough time, or maybe he has updated, but I think the way he has modeled the BC conservatives is heavily dependent on the BC liberals. And I think this is a mistake, ultimately. For instance, in my model, what I've done is I went back to 2019 and 2021 at the federal level, and I took the results of the federal conservative, federal PPC, and the BC liberals in the provincial map, and I created like a conservative index. And there's a lot of math and again assumption. But so the way I model my party in BC is closer or more aligned with the federal conservatives. And if you do this, then in Vancouver, you do have a few of those seats where the BC Liberals used to do better than the BC Conservative, than the federal Conservatives on the same seats. And then if you go in the interior, that's the opposite. So I would be cautious about using the 338 forecast, whether in my riding, in Pont Grey. I think they're unfortunately too optimistic for us. And, I understand that I should say otherwise as a political spin, but with that being said, his model might be slightly too optimistic, but my own model shows that, yeah, weirdly enough, David EB is not 100% safe. I thought he would be, but no, polls after polls, projections after projections. I don't publish them anymore, but I still make them for myself. And I told Paul, I was like, this is pretty crazy, but I do have you with you're not winning, but you're not losing by 20 points. I mean, there is a chance, in particular, if David EB has to spend so much time out of his riding, that you could actually be winning your seat. So we're gonna see that. That would be a monumental surprise, right? But
That's a good thing for you guys if he has to spend more time in
yeah,
his riding because then he's not everywhere else.
yeah.
But is there anything else you want to talk about with the BC Conservatives before I end this video?
No, I mean, the, the one thing I would say, and especially if you're not from BC, but and if you just follow BC elections as like a hobby, the one city that I think you should be watching is Surrey. Surrey is a city in the suburb of Vancouver. It's the second biggest city. It's the fastest growing city. They might actually be bigger than Vancouver within 10 years, honestly, given population growth. And it's a city that is very heavily Indians, right, or South Asian with the Sikhs and Indian people. And this is a city that used to be super dark orange or super dark red at the federal levels, right? As a matter of fact, many federal projections have the federal liberals of Justin Trudeau win only one seat in BC, and that would be in Surrey. And what we have seen over the last 6 months, both in polls and at the door or anecdotal evidence out there is a massive flip in this riding, in this city, in this community. And this fall, if we win, if my party wins, I predict that it's going to be because Surrey will have gone from dark orange to dark blue, which is not a realignment we usually see happening that fast. Like 4 years and going from one extreme to the other, it's relatively rare. So that would be the one to follow. That's really the one that will decide the election.
So would you say like South Asians, I didn't even realize that, are apparently now shifting towards the conservatives. Would you say that there are other demographics, especially of like immigrants too, that could favor the BC conservatives apart from them?
Yeah. So obviously, yes, South Asian, yes, they're definitely realigning. And when I go in my writing, I have about 10% of South Asian in my writing or speak Punjabi, for instance, at home. And I would say most of the time when somebody tells me, "Oh yeah, we like you, we vote for you," like straight up, they have been almost always South Asian. So there is really, it's amazing. I'm canvassing a writing, a part of my writing that's supposed to be heavy red, heavy federal liberals, and they hate Trudeau, they hate the NDP now. So they have really completely flipped. Other groups, well, obviously, we have a large Chinese population in BC. Most of them are not even immigrants anymore. Right? Let's be clear. My wife is Chinese, but she's been here for like 35 years, so that doesn't count as immigrant
Yeah.
anymore. They would be traditionally conservative. It kind of changed in 2021 right at the federal level. So we're working hard on this community because I think they align with us on for instance drug addiction and on crime. They're very much very conservative. After this other uh, immigrant populations, my writing has I'm gonna talk for my writings. We have quite a lot of Filipino people in my writing, and there as well. Everything I know about them, I have some friends from this community. They're naturally conservative, so we should be convincing them to vote for us. But that's not a realignment, right? It's more like the natural level for those communities. The South Asian is really the one that has been switching.
Hmm. Yeah. You'd maybe think of one more question, and that is, where do you think the Trudeau fact? What do you think the effect of the Trudeau factor is in this election? Because it seems like the Trudeau factor, which is like just how I describe the whole Trudeau's unpopular, so it like goes down into provincial politics. Who do you think does that hurt the NDP, and will that hurt them a lot more? Like, do you think you've been effectively able to make the criticism that the NDP is basically just an extension of the Liberals to the average BC voter?
So I think we've done a good job at this, the party. I don't know if it has been successful enough yet. To be fair, we're still in July with literally 3 months before the election. Most people, when you go talk to them, most people haven't thought about politics and they think about provincial politics even less than federal politics. So, so we know what is very clear is, yeah, Trudeau is really, really disliked. I mean, nobody wants to vote for him. When you tell them, oh no, but I'm running provincially against David Eby and the NDP, then usually sometimes you see people like change. They don't, and I don't think there is the same hatred for David Eby or the same discontent with this government, unfortunately. I always joke that it would be easier if we were to run against Trudeau than the BC NDP. And that's fair. I mean, but I think the more we go at it and the more people look at this, the more we realize, we literally have a federal MP that just resigned, right, in Langley to run for the provincial NDP. So there are a lot of connections, right? I mean, between them. So and David Eby and Justin Trudeau, they might sound different, like they have different approach. Like I think Eby is slightly more populist at times in his rhetoric, but in terms of policies, in terms of what they believe, they completely agree on everything. And so we're gonna see. I mean, obviously, the more we can tie them together, the better it is for us. And I think David Eby knows it, right? That's why he doesn't hesitate nowadays to go against the federals, right? I mean, he has spoken openly against the immigration targets of the federal government uh, and other issues. So he's trying to distance himself after years of doing the same, right? He flip-flop on the drug decriminalization, but he was completely in on it, right? I mean, so it's very convenient to do this like 3 months before the election. Will voters be tricked by this type of behavior? I don't think so. I think most people will realize that they're essentially the same center left to radical left. And I always tell people, right, again, I said earlier today in this interview that it's not specific issues to me. It's really a general pattern of things being broken. And I tell people the same people who are part of the federal liberals and who decide policies at the federal level, they're the same type of people who decide and who are part of the premier's office in Victoria. And we need to make sure that these people are not in power anymore because they they're radicals ideologically, and everything they do doesn't work. It's really absolutely crazy. They're really smart people. They're not stupid. They're highly educated, smart people, but they're completely wrong on so many issues, and they're the same. So the more we can, and I genuinely believe this. I genuinely believe that the average advisor or political counselor in for David Eby is very comfortable with what Trudeau has been doing.
Who do you think voters blame for the decrim decriminalization, carbon tax, all that stuff? Would you say they blame more David Eby or they blame Justin Trudeau more,
Okay, so that's
rightly
gonna
or
be a pure
wrongly?
guess. I would say the decriminalization, they're gonna blame. EB more because that has been a BC problem. And, every time we have news about this, it has been, it's only BC really. Alberta has had some problem, but all those deaths and the east side of the downtown of the downtown in Vancouver, this is a very BC centric, very Vancouver centric. So I think people will blame Victoria and David Eby and not Ottawa. On the carbon tax, ironically, I think they will blame Justin Trudeau, even though we have our own carbon tax and we were the first one to have it right in 2008. But the in the political discourse, the carbon tax has become completely associated with Justin Trudeau.
Mhm. Well, I'd like to thank you again for joining me today on my YouTube channel. If you want to check out what Bryan has to say on Twitter, I'll link his Twitter in the description of this video. But apart from that, anything you want to say in closing?
No, I mean, obviously you have an audience Canada-wide. This is great. And, I have many followers outside of BC, but uh, I will just make a call. If you're watching this and you like me and or my party, and especially if you're in my riding or just in Vancouver, I mean, just, send me a DM or send me an email. You can easily find my email and on the webpage of the BC Conservatives. Uh, and, get involved. I can use more volunteers. I can use more donations, even small donations out there really, really help. And so anyway, if people want to get involved, just get involved. You just reach out. I mean, most of my volunteers, I've found them on Twitter. I mean, they're people I've been interacting with on Twitter for years. So sometimes it's jarring to go from this, you observing politics and to actually participating. But this is great. Then you make friends. Most of my best friends, I mean, in Quebec, I met them in uh, working for a political party as well. So don't hesitate at some point, don't be shy. Reach out to people actually running.
Hmm. Well, I think that concludes this video. I hope you guys enjoyed watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.